Hello, this is Joe Neville and welcome to Python and Aruba OS Switch API. In this video I'll be showing you how to import data into Python from a YAML file. Now the first couple of videos in this series were focused on specific features of Aruba OS Switch. Now let's move on and investigate other aspects of Python interacting with APIs. I think this is important because while there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Python tutorials out there, very few are aimed at networkers. I've been learning Python for a couple of years now, and I'll be talking about those aspects of Python that I believe could be of use to other networkers and those getting into Python for the first time. Okay, you may have noticed that the scripts that I've been using in this series so far have been very basic. No classes or functions, just simple API calls. And that was on purpose. I wanted to give examples that were beginner friendly, but now it's time to look at improving these API call scripts. First up, let's introduce YAML into the setup. So what is YAML? Well, someone involved in naming YAML has a certain sense of humour because YAML stands for YAML Ain't Markup Language. To quote YAML.org, YAML is a human-friendly data serialization standard for all programming languages. Okay, great. So what does that mean? Well, it's a way of presenting data structures with a top priority of being readable to humans. The basic native data structures are scalars, sequences, and mappings. At the risk of explaining YAML too simplistically, this means that we can store data using the YAML syntax rules and import that into Python as the trusty data types that we're already aware of: strings, integers, lists, and dictionaries. But before we get into the demo, let's ask why this is beneficial. Well, I don't think it's too outlandish to state that it is widely acknowledged that recycling, repurposing, and reusing things, call it what you will, is a good thing. This applies to supermarket carrier bags, but it also applies to code. Here's a basic example. Look at this script for authenticating on a switch. In the script, there are variables. That's fine for single use, but what do we do if we want to perform this call to a switch with a different IP address? As you can see, the data variables in there are the URL, which contains an IP address, and we've got the username and the password in there. So if we want to send the call to a different switch with a different IP address, we need to change that in the script. Thus, this script is tied to a single IP address. Change the IP means changing the script, and that's not very efficient. Now, with just a small, simple script such as this, it might not seem like a big deal, but as we scale up, such dependencies become a major headache. Thus, to save us from migraines, we need to remove the dependencies, and that means removing the specific data variables from our script and replacing them with essentially placeholder objects that represent the data. That means we can reuse and recycle our script with different devices and not have to touch it. Great, so where do the data variables come from then? No prizes for guessing that we import them from the YAML file. A quick bit of housekeeping before we jump into the code. I'm going to be using a third-party library to perform the action of importing the data from YAML into Python, and that means I needed to do a pip install of PyYAML. Okay, let's dive into PyCharm then and look at the code. Now, over on the right here, what I have is a very simple YAML file. As you can see, you've got the file name and then .yaml, which designates that it is a YAML file, of course. And I found that with PyCharm and some other text editors and IDEs that I looked at, they can handle YAML. So what we have here is we have different pieces of data set up in different structures in accordance with the syntax rules for YAML. Now, if you would like further details about this, you can find it all on YAML.org. We're just going to be looking at some very simple structures that we will commonly use when making API calls. So here we have a Beatles themed YAML file as our first example. This first type here, this data structure here, now that's a string when we import it into Python. There we have the number 9, so that's an integer in Python. Here, this so these list of albums, that's a list designated via this hyphen here. And finally, we've got a key value pair, so a mapping between band and Beatles. So that will be imported into Python as a dictionary. So, right, how do we go about importing the data from the YAML file? So what we have, first of all, we have to import YAML. So that's the PyYAML file that we're importing there. And then we have this simple setup to read, so with open, and that's the file name of the YAML file there on the right. We do the file name and then we read that as stream. And what we're doing, because this is actually different data structures here, so there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4 different data structures in that. What we do is I've got a for loop just to show you that it's actually imported as I say it is. So we're going to go through each one of these data structures and we're importing those, and I'm going to print them out and then print the type for you. So it's for x in YAML.loadAll, and we're loading the stream and then printing out x. Okay, there we go. So that's our output that's printed. And as I said, so Penny Lane, there, notice that there's no quotation marks around it, but that will come in as a string. So that's the type of X that's come in, a string. 9 has come in as an integer, so we didn't need to do anything. It's just recognize that this is a string, that's an integer. Next up, square brackets. So our list of albums, that's a list. And then finally, we've got our curly brackets, key value pair, so that is a dictionary. So this is a small piece of code that we can reuse to read the YAML file. Easiest way to do this is just save the YAML file in the same directory as the Python file. When you go to run it, it will be able to find it via the file name. Okay, let's move on to an API call then. So this one should look familiar. What we're doing is reusing the any CLI call, but this time the data variables will be in the YAML file, not in the Python script. So over on the right here, we've got any CLI underscore YAML.YAML. In there, I've got my username, my password, my IP address, and the command that I want to send, so show IP route. Over on the left here, I've got my any CLI underscore YAML.py, and first of all I've got my imports, bearing in mind, remember that we've had to put in the import YAML there, and then I've got a similar part that I've already shown you with this open of the YAML file as stream. Now there's only one section to the YAML file, unlike that first example I showed you, so that's slightly different. We're just using YAML.load for that. Okay, so what I've got here is open as stream, and I've got a try there and an accept in case there's any kind of error. So it's some simple error checking, and what I'm going to do for this first part of this is I will show you what happens when you import this into Python, and I'm printing out this data object that I'll create called YAML underscore data. So let's run that. Okay, there we go. So what do we have there? Curly brackets, this is a dictionary. Okay, so we've got key value pairs for all of those variables, those data variables. Okay, so key and value, etc. Good. So what we can do is we can call the values as we normally would call a dictionary, and then we can create data objects from those values. Let's do that. Let's run that again then, and what I'm going to do is I will print out one of the objects that I'm creating. So as you can see here, I am opening the file, I'm importing the data from the YAML file, and then down here I'm creating different objects. So I've got IP_address, and the way that we reference that, standard way of doing it within Python, is we reference the dictionary and then we call in the square brackets we call the key, and that will give us the value. Okay, so the IP address will be the value there. So 192.168.2.1, which of course is the IP address that we need. And we carry on and do that for username, password, and command. Okay, so I've run that just to print out the IP address, and as you can see, it works as expected. Great, so let's move on and incorporate these data objects into the full script and send it at our switch. Right, now the next part to be aware of is, of course, we don't have the IP address in the script. We've got those data objects that we've created, those placeholders instead. But we've still got to create the URL. So the way that I've done that is to create an object for the URL, which I can then reuse. I've got the string of the HTTP, and I've added in the IP address. So the IP address I'm going to grab from YAML, fine, and then I add it in here and create that URL. Same with the username and password. So we've got essentially this placeholder for username and password. The username from up here is going to be placed in here and create those credentials that I need when I'm sending them off to the switch for authentication. And the final one of the objects to look out for is the command, which I include there. Right, so there we are. Let me take that print statement out and we will run this script. So if all works as expected, we're going to log in to my switch 192.168.2.1, and then we're going to get our cookie here, and then we're going to do a post. It's the CLI, so it's any CLI feature that I'm using here. And we are going to dump the command, which is our show IP route. And there we go. That looks successful. So we've got our status code of 200, and that's my routing table. Thus, if I want to change anything, I don't have to touch my script anymore. I just go over to my YAML file, which is much easier to read than going through the Python script and trying to find out every instance of the IP address and the command that I'm using. I can just go over to this humanly readable, well, easier to read file and make the change there. And that means that I can pass the script around and not have to change it. So much more reusable, much more scalable. I'll finish up by changing it to show up. And there we go, I've got the ARP table. Okay, so just changing the YAML, it's imported, and then we do the whole process again without touching our Python script. Great, so that was importing data from a YAML file into Python. I hope you found that useful. Please do like, comment, and subscribe. More videos coming soon, but for now, thanks for watching. My name's Joe Neville, and goodbye.